We were camping in a small remote lake in New Mexico. Suddenly, our group heard the unmistakable cries of a young girl in need of help. There were about 8 of us together in our camping spot, and another group of 3 about 50 feet away. We immediately looked to their campsite since we had no children with us. My husband and his sister walked to the other site and asked them if they also heard the noise. Indeed, they had. They didn't have any children with them either. There seemed to be no doubt that we were hearing a real voice in the darkness. However, this seemed unlikely to me. I was certain that it was a fox, coyote, maybe an injured deer, or even some type of a bird. Determined to find the source of the cries, we all headed towards the field behind our campsite. I thought we'd make so much noise as such a large group of people crawling through the brush that we'd scare it away if it were a real animal. But as we crept through the darkness towards the source of the noise, something caught our attention. A tall white figure standing out against the night sky. The horrifying creature looming in the distance was ghostly, tall, and impossibly white, radiating an otherworldly aura that sent shivers down our spines. We all felt an immediate sense of fear and unease as we realized that this thing was no ordinary human being. Shrouded in mystery with its ghostly pale skin and terrifying presence, it seemed to penetrate us to our core. All of us had goosebumps and were speechless at the sight. Despite our fear, though, we could not turn away from this terrifying creature. Held captive by a strange horror story unfolding before our eyes, we continued towards this ghostly specter, drawn towards it by an inexplicable sense of curiosity and dread, until suddenly it vanished. Then it reappeared to our left. Half the group began a hasty retreat immediately towards the campsite, while the rest of us were simply petrified as if we'd been turned to stone. Time seemed to stand still as the creature stood slowly and moved back to its original spot, then faded away in the night as if floating away further into the desert night. Whether it was truly a spirit from beyond or merely some trick of nature or mind, none can say. 3 of the campers next to us packed up that night and drove away as quickly as they could to the nearest motel. I thought to myself, wouldn't it be hysterical if that motel was haunted too? The rest of us? We gathered our tents together as if circling the wagons and stayed up the rest of the night telling funny stories around the campsite. After having possibly witnessed a real ghost that night, no one was interested in telling any scary stories. But that night, in the field, at that campsite, something mysterious yet frightening passed through us all, leaving memories and questions that have haunted us to this day. My first job out of college was at a residential mental health facility. I worked as a night janitor, though I was studying to get into medical school. As a result, I had the opportunity to observe many different symptoms in patients. I frequently used opportunities to chat with the night nurses and resident physicians who had no choice but to do rotations there. During the daytime, there were real doctors there, psychiatrists, but they were often too busy to pay attention to me. The residents were happy to have a conversation with me, though. Maybe because I wasn't there to ask them to do any extra work, I just wanted to learn. In any case, there was one patient that still perplexes me to this day. I remember the day he arrived, as I had the not-so-pleasant job of taking his clothing to the laundry along with all the rest of the residents' linens. At first glance, this man appeared quite normal. Though he had a full, bushy black beard, otherwise his physique seemed relatively average, and his mannerisms were calm and composed. However, when he arrived, he was covered from head to toe with dust, clad in tattered rags as if they had clearly been his only means of protection from the elements for many years. His fingernails were torn and he had scratches all over his skin. The odor emanating from his body, I'd prefer to forget. Yet after all these years, I can still recall the pungent, sweet smell of his room long after he'd had his clothes replaced in the hospital patient scrubs. When the admitting nurses examined his dusty clothes, they noticed something strange, or rather, they noticed the absence of something that most people carry. He had no wallet, no money, no phone, nothing in his pockets. He wore no jewelry or rings of any kind. Wondering if he may have committed some crimes and was trying to hide from retribution, the staff called the local police, who obtained fingerprints from him without any resistance. They still bore a shocking resemblance to what appeared to be those of a known living person. Confused yet intrigued by this odd discovery, authorities called in the man's alleged family, who insisted that he'd been dead for many years. Finally, they agreed on DNA testing, hoping they could finally put an end to this saga once and for all. And although nobody expected it, detectives confirmed that his fingerprints belonged to none other than their dear departed relatives. Yet they were still in disbelief. Had they proved that even after death, some spirits never truly rest? His name was Abel Aiken. Abel apparently grew up in the Florida Panhandle right next to Louisiana. I remember when his family came up to visit. It had taken them 2 full days to drive across the country. His father and brother drove together as his mother was too sick to travel. She waited at home anxiously to learn whether or not this was really her son, whom she believed had died in a tragic car accident. Apparently, the night he went missing, a neighbor noted that their car had been stolen. After a typical search, the car hadn't turned up, and neither had her son. Years later, a diving team identified the car, and it was pulled from the lake that was just half a mile from their home. Inside the car was an engraved pocket knife that Abel's grandfather had given to him on his 16th birthday. That car matched the one that had been missing from the neighbor's house, but no body was ever found, and no clues were left in the vehicle, aside from that pocket knife. The family had him declared dead after 5 years, though his mother never stopped thinking about him. He kept his room quite neat, so there was never anything for me to do but sweep out the corners of his room. But there was something strange about him that could not be explained by the doctors or nurses. Abel Aiken would not or could not remember leaving home that night, and he had no idea how he ended up in Nebraska over 10 years later. Some speculated that he suffered from some sort of mental illness, while others believed that he had come into contact with a force that had somehow rendered him unable to speak. Sometimes I wondered if someone had cast a black magic spell on him, but I'd never find out from him personally. Abel's eyes were vacant, and he displayed no apparent attachment to anything at all. He didn't talk to any residents. He sat alone during meals. Despite his family coming to visit and hoping for a reconciliation, they insisted that this was not their son. Unfortunately, the DNA evidence was declared null and void because the swabs the police collected had not been properly labeled and stored after collection. When the family refused to believe that this man was their son, there was still no explanation as to where the DNA match would have come from. Abel's sister tearfully said goodbye, and his family left him at the facility. We were powerless to force them to take him home due to the shoddy handling of the collected swabs. I only know this because after they had been collected that night, I found the swabs and placed them in a drawer with a note for the morning charge nurse to call the detectives back. I suppose anyone could have handled those swabs that night. While Abel didn't show any emotion about his father and siblings leaving, he held that stuffed animal every night, rocking in his bed until he fell asleep. I never heard him cry or speak about his past with anyone. It was almost as if he was a ghost trapped in the world of the living. Despite all this, Abel managed to live a relatively normal life within the facility, working, eating, sleeping like everyone else. I still wonder what truly drove him to such extremes to have 10 years of his life seemingly vanished from his memory. And though it may sound scary to say it aloud, I often found myself drawn to Abel's quiet presence and intrigued by the story of his mysterious silence. I hope to see him again. I did get into medical school, and I'm currently hoping to become a psychiatrist. For now, however, Abel remains an enigma, shrouded in a spooky fascination. Perhaps someday I'll see Abel Aiken again and learn what happened to him. If you've been truly frightened by any of my stories, hit subscribe so you don't miss any of them. I was driving across the country with my mom and sister, and I'll never forget the night our journey took a spooky turn. We had been on the road for days, and at one point we stopped at a rest stop to fill our car and use the restroom. As we approached the gas station, we noticed that there were several young people there, a group of teenagers on a road trip, as well as a small gray car parked at the pump in front of us with 2 young men standing still outside of it. Something felt off about the scene. It was late at night, but we felt wide awake and alert. As my mom and sister went inside to grab some snacks and use the bathroom, I opted to stay behind and fill up the tank. All of a sudden, I heard the sound of panicked voices coming from nearby. The teenagers were saying that they couldn't get their gas pump working properly, and they seemed really spooked out by something. To my surprise, they quickly left the gas station in their van without hesitation. As I watched them drive off into the night, I couldn't help but feel nervous myself. Something about that place seemed downright haunted. Maybe it was just my imagination running wild. After being on the road for so long, I was glad to see my mom and sister return to the car, ready to hit the road again. Just as I finished pumping and stepped closer to the station doors to get my change, however, 2 men suddenly emerged from within. They appeared to be frozen in place, not moving a muscle, not even talking or looking at each other. As my sister and my mom ran up to join me outside the building, we all noticed something chilling. The 2 men had pitch-black eyes that seemed to reflect nothing at all back at us. Intensely unsettled by this encounter, we quickly got back into our car and sped off down the highway as fast as we could. But despite our efforts, we could not find that strange abandoned gas station on any map. It seemed to have mysteriously disappeared off the face of the earth. What truly terrified me about this whole experience was that even now, many years later, whenever I close my eyes and try to remember that mysterious old gas station and its eerie inhabitants, all I see are those terrifying black eyes staring back at me. We may never know what really went on there.